She was the most photographed woman in the world. Every court in Europe kept her portrait. Every newspaper that printed her image sold out by noon. She was the Empress of Austria, the Queen of Hungary, the living proof that the Habsburg dynasty still produced something the world wanted to look at. She had 4 children. The first died in her arms at the age of 2, in a city she had been warned not to visit. The second survived, but by the time the second daughter was old enough to write letters, there was almost nothing to say between them. The third, her only son, the heir to a 500-year empire, shot himself to death at a hunting lodge on the 30th of January 1889. He was 30 years old. The girl beside him was 17. And the fourth, the only one Sisi ever called her child, the only one she raised herself, the only one she spoke to in the language she loved, lived to watch her mother stabbed in the chest on a Geneva pier by a man with a sharpened file who couldn't afford a real knife. Empress Elisabeth of Austria. The world still loves her. The movies made her a fairy tale. The museums sell her diamond stars by the thousand. Her children had a different story. And in the distance between the fairy tale and the funerals, between the diamond stars and the imperial crypt, is the thing the Habsburg court spent a century working very hard to prevent you from knowing. In the last months of her life, Sisi said something to her youngest daughter about her children. Marie Valerie wrote it down. We will come back to it. She was not supposed to be there. In the summer of 1853, Archduchess Sophie, the mother of Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria, the most powerful woman in the Habsburg court, arranged a meeting at the mountain resort of Bad Ischl in Upper Austria. The purpose was understood by everyone present. The emperor was 23 years old. He needed a wife. Sophie had selected one already. Duchess Helene of Bavaria, the eldest daughter of her own sister Princess Ludovica. A niece. Someone known. Someone manageable. Helene came to Bad Ischl. Her mother came. And her 15-year-old sister came along as an afterthought, a girl who had been in a depression since the death of a young count she had loved, and whose mother thought the journey might help. The girl's name was Elizabeth. Franz Joseph was supposed to propose to Helene. He looked at her younger sister instead. The younger sister had arrived in black. Her gala dress had travelled in a separate carriage that never caught up, and the black made her look more striking, not less. Franz Joseph told his mother, if he could not have Elizabeth, he would not marry at all. Archduchess Sophie was furious. She gave in. On the 24th of April, 1854, 16-year-old Elisabeth of Bavaria became Empress of Austria, Queen of Hungary, and the wife of a man she had known for less than a year. She was not prepared for a single thing that followed. Sisi's first daughter was christened without her consent, named for the woman who would take her away. 3 days after the birth, the child was moved. Sisi was not told in advance. The Habsburg court operated on protocol so rigid it had its own name and its own full-time administrators. Every movement was regulated: who could sit in whose presence, which door to use entering which room, how long a curtsy needed to last for which rank. Sisi had grown up running barefoot through Possenhofen Castle in Bavaria, skipping Latin lessons to ride through the countryside, writing poetry in her room at midnight. She arrived at the Hofburg Palace in Vienna and encountered a machine. The machine was run by Archduchess Sophie. Observers of the Habsburg court had a saying about Archduchess Sophie of Bavaria, Franz Joseph's mother, Elizabeth's aunt, the woman who had engineered the marriage. They called her the only man in the Hofburg. She was not described this way because anyone thought her masculine. She was described this way because she was the only person in the palace who made decisions and kept them. Franz Joseph adored her. He consulted her on everything. He had, since childhood, done as she advised. When Elizabeth arrived at court, Archduchess Sophie assessed her, young, beautiful, unprepared, and entirely unsuited in Sophie's view for the business of producing and raising the next generation of Habsburgs. So Sophie decided she would handle it herself. In 1865, the painter Franz Xaver Winterhalter was commissioned to make Empress Elisabeth's formal portrait. She was 27 years old. He painted her standing in a white evening gown, her hair dressed with 8 diamond stars, a commission she had designed herself, each star a cluster of real diamonds set on wires so they trembled as she moved. Her waist, at the time of the sitting, was documented at 50 centimeters. She maintained it through a discipline that would read, to a modern physician, as a clinical record rather than a beauty regimen. A diet that, in her later years, was reduced almost entirely to raw meat juice, warm milk, and egg whites. Daily walks of 3, 4, 5 hours at a pace her ladies-in-waiting could rarely match. Private exercises, rings, parallel bars installed in her apartments at her own request. A scale she stepped onto every morning and a book in which she recorded the result. The world saw the portrait and understood. This was the most beautiful royal in Europe. What the portrait does not show is what was happening, simultaneously, in the rooms above, where it was painted. Sisi's first child had been born on the 5th of March, 1855, a daughter. The delivery lasted until past 3 in the afternoon, with Archduchess Sophie seated outside the bedchamber for most of it, knitting. When the baby arrived, it was christened that same day, without the mother being asked, Sophie Friederike Dorothea Maria Josepha, named in full for the grandmother who had not been in the room. A year later, on the 12th of July, 1856, a second daughter arrived. Her name was Gisela. Both girls, immediately after baptism, were relocated to Archduchess Sophie's apartments in the Hofburg. Empress Elisabeth, the woman in the portrait, the one the newspapers called the most beautiful royal in Europe, was permitted to visit her daughters on a schedule set by someone else. She described it herself in a letter that has survived. She took my children from me straight away. I was only allowed to see them when Sophie gave her consent. She was always present when I went to visit the children. Eventually I could only concede to her, and only seldom went up to see them. No matter how often she asked Franz Joseph to intervene, he did not. He was, as he had been since boyhood, his mother's son first, and his wife's husband second. The woman in the portrait was Empress of Austria. She owned nothing, not the children she had carried, not the schedule on which she saw them, not even the name of the first daughter she had delivered. She was 16 when she married. She was in her 20s when she understood what she had married into. And in 1857, the year the Winterhalter portrait was not yet painted, the year the diamond stars did not yet exist, she and Franz Joseph took a journey to Hungary. She brought her children with her. It was the last time she and her eldest daughter were in the same place alive. I told you about the first daughter. Born the 5th of March, 1855, named Sophie after her grandmother without Elizabeth's consent, relocated to Archduchess Sophie's apartments within days of baptism before the ink on the christening records was dry. A child who technically belonged to an empress and was materially controlled by the woman the empress could not override. For 2 years, that was the arrangement. Sophie the infant grew in rooms that were not her mother's. She was tended by nurses that were not her mother's choice. She was dressed and fed and supervised on a schedule that Elizabeth could observe but not alter. And then came the journey to Hungary. In 1857, a lithographer named Joseph Krehuber made a formal image of the imperial family, Franz, Joseph and Elizabeth seated together, their 2 daughters beside them. Sophie, age 2, wearing white. Gisela, 10 months, in a bassinet. It is one of the only records that shows the family of 4 complete. It was made the same year Sophie died. The court in Vienna had never trusted Hungary. Archduchess Sophie, who had spent 3 decades managing the Habsburg Empire's internal politics, considered the Hungarians not subjects but problems. And she had made her view of the planned royal tour quite clear. The children should stay in Vienna, under her supervision, where they were safe. Elizabeth had fought her on this. She had brought both girls to the tour specifically, her own act of maternal assertion, her own refusal to leave her children behind in someone else's apartments again. On the 4th of May, 1857, the imperial family arrived in Buda, the ancient fortified hill across the Danube from Pest. Franz Joseph and Elizabeth were to begin their formal tour of Hungary on May 13. But both girls had fallen ill. Not seriously, not dangerously. The doctors attributed it to teething, which is what doctors attributed most things to when the patient was an infant and the diagnosis was uncertain. The tour was delayed 10 days. During those 10 days, Elizabeth stayed with her daughters. On May 23, the tour began. They travelled through Hungarian cities Debrecen, Eger, Miskolc, the great flat plains of the Puszta. On May 28, they arrived in Debrecen, when a courier brought word from Buda. Sophie's condition had changed. They left immediately. The next morning they arrived back in Buda and found the child alive. Gisela had already recovered, Sophie had not. The illness the doctors had called teething had become something else entirely. Typhus, or dysentery, or a combination of both. The court physician could not diagnose it precisely, even as it progressed. At approximately 9:15 in the evening of the 29th of May, 1857, Archduchess Sophie of Austria, 2 years and 2 months old, the first child of Franz Joseph and Elizabeth, the child named after her grandmother without her mother's consent, died. She died between her parents' arms. Franz Joseph wrote immediately to his mother in Vienna. The letter was short. He had been trained his entire life to write with precision, to keep his communications brief and factual. This one was neither. Our sweetheart is an angel in the heaven yet. We perished. 4 words in the second sentence. He could not write more. In the weeks after Sophie's death, Elizabeth wrote a poem. It was not published during her lifetime. The last line is the only line that matters. In Vienna, Archduchess Sophie received the letter. And in the days that followed in the court's quiet, effective, thoroughly Habsburg way, the conclusion was reached and communicated in the manner of courts, not by accusation, not by confrontation but by implication, by atmosphere, by the specific silence that falls in a room when someone enters and the conversation changes. The conclusion was this. Elizabeth had insisted on bringing the children to Hungary. Archduchess Sophie had warned her. The court physician had been uncertain from the beginning. The tour had been delayed because the children were already unwell. And still they had gone to Debrecen, to the Puszta, to a country that Vienna considered barely safe for adults. Nobody said directly that Elizabeth had killed her daughter. Nobody had to. The Empress blamed herself for the death of her child, as she had taken the children with her against the advice of her mother-in-law. That sentence appears in contemporary accounts. It was not something Elizabeth disputed. She had insisted. She had won the argument. And 3 weeks later, Sophie was dead in her arms in Buda. She never forgave herself for it, not entirely, not in 41 years of life that remained after that night. There are specific ways that grief breaks a parent's relationship with the children who survive. The most common is redirection. The surviving child becomes the repository of everything the dead child was supposed to be. Every achievement is freighted with the weight of a name that no longer exists. Every ordinary failure is a reminder that the wrong one survived. That was not what happened to Gisela. What happened to Gisela was, in some ways, more complete. After Sophie's death in Buda, Elizabeth returned to Vienna. She was 20 years old. She had just watched a child die in her arms in a foreign city and had spent the journey home understanding in the Habsburg way that the court considered her responsible. And the thing that had already been difficult, the connection to her surviving children, the access to them, the ability to be their mother in any practical sense, became something she stopped fighting for. She left Gisela's upbringing entirely in the hands of the court. Not as a formal arrangement, not as a signed document, as a withdrawal, as the behavior of a woman who had tried once to assert maternal authority, had brought her children on a journey to prove it, and had come back with one of them in a coffin. Gisela grew up in Vienna, under the supervision of governesses and court officials. She was educated as a Habsburg princess. She learned the protocol, the curtsy, the language of court. She became, by all accounts, a competent and well-adjusted young woman who adapted to her circumstances far more easily than her mother ever had. Which was, perhaps, because Gisela's circumstances were never as extreme as her mother's. The court gave Gisela stability. Elizabeth gave Gisela gifts and letters from a distance, and, on her visits to Vienna, the presence of a woman who was beautiful and famous, and fundamentally elsewhere. In January 1874, Gisela went into labour with her first child early, unexpectedly, after hours of agonizing labour that left both mother and infant briefly thought unlikely to survive. The child was named Elisabeth Marie Auguste. Empress Elisabeth Sisi, the woman in the Winterhalter portrait, the most famous royal in Europe, travelled immediately to Munich when she received the news. She arrived after the birth was over. She did not stay at the palace with her daughter and newborn granddaughter. She took lodgings at a nearby inn. She later wrote, in her own words, that mother and child were so healthy that her presence was not required. Gisela's daughter was her first grandchild. She stayed at an inn. The relationship between Sisi and Gisela was never a close one. That is the polite formulation. The more precise one is, Sisi had a daughter who survived and a granddaughter who was born, and on both occasions she found reasons to be somewhere else. In 1865, Sisi entered her son's room and found something. The tutor had been in charge for 6 years. What she found ended his employment within the month. Rudolph Franz Karl Joseph was born on the 21st of August, 1858, at Schloss Laxenburg, a castle south of Vienna, 1 year after Sophie's death. He was the third child. He was the longed-for son. He was the heir. The morning after his birth, his first full day of life outside the womb, his father appointed him commander of an infantry regiment. He was 1 day old. By the time he was 2, he had his first military uniform. The man responsible for Rudolph's education from the beginning was Major General Count Leopold Gondrecourt, a high-ranking military officer whose educational philosophy could be summarized as follows. A future emperor must be tough, and if the child was not tough, you made him tough by force. In practice, this meant hours of rigorous military drilling conducted in all weather conditions, rain, cold, the full Austrian winter. It meant sleep deprivation. And it meant a technique that Gondrecourt employed specifically to harden what he considered Rudolph's excessive sensitivity. He would fire a pistol shot in the room where the child was sleeping, in the middle of the night, without warning. Rudolph was a sensitive child. He had a delicate constitution. He was, by every account that survives, a boy whose natural temperament ran toward curiosity and feeling, rather than endurance and command. Gondrecourt considered this a deficiency to be corrected. The corrections drove Rudolph to what the Habsburg court's own records describe as the verge of mental and physical breakdown. Meanwhile, his mother was absent. Not absent from the country, absent from the parenting. After Sophie's death, after the grief and the court's blame and the withdrawal from Gisela, Elizabeth had been travelling. Corfu, Madeira, the Greek coast, the English countryside. The Hofburg was a place she returned to rather than lived in. She was there for state occasions, for appearances that could not be avoided. She was rarely there for the ordinary days of her children's lives. Rudolph grew up in rooms she seldom entered, supervised by a man whose methods she did not know. In 1865, Rudolph was 6 years old. Gondricourt had been in charge for 6 years. Elizabeth returned to Vienna and discovered what had been happening. The records do not state precisely what she saw in that room. What they state is what she did immediately afterward. She wrote to Franz Joseph. The letter is known now as the Ischl ultimatum, named for the mountain resort at Bad Ischl where it was composed. Its terms were simple, and by the standards of what a Habsburg empress had ever demanded of a Habsburg emperor, extraordinary. Either she received absolute authority over the upbringing and education of her children, or she would leave the court permanently. Franz Joseph gave in. Gondricourt was removed within the month. A new tutor was appointed, Count Joseph Latour von Thurnberg, a man of liberal views who within weeks had established a relationship of genuine trust with the frightened, damaged, highly intelligent boy that 6 years of Gondricourt had produced. Latour stayed with Rudolph for 12 years until 1877, when Rudolph's education was formally complete. He was one of the first people Elizabeth contacted when Rudolph died at Mayerling in 1889. What the Ischl ultimatum won for Rudolph was 12 years of something approaching a real education. What it could not win, what no tutor appointment could restore, was the 6 years that Gondricourt had already taken. The pistol shots in the night, the drilling in the rain, the systematic, authorized destruction of a child's sense of safety in the only home he had. Rudolph never fully recovered from what Gondricourt did to him. The physicians who examined him in his final years noted a man in chronic pain, chronically medicated, chronically estranged from the stability that a normal childhood might have provided. He was 30 years old when he died at Mayerling. He had been afraid of the dark since he was 6. The records do not tell us what Elizabeth found in that room. They do not give us a specific image, a specific incident, a single moment that finally broke through whatever Elizabeth had been telling herself about Gondricourt's methods and the Crown Prince's education. What they tell us is what she did. In the summer of 1865, she visited her son's rooms in the Hofburg. Rudolph was 6 years old. She had been mostly absent since his birth: England, Corfu, Madeira, the Bavarian lakes. The distances she put between herself and Vienna were legendary. The court considered them scandalous. But she went to his rooms that summer. And whatever she saw, whatever state she found a 6-year-old child in, after 6 years of Gondricourt's pistol shots in the night and drilling in the rain, was enough. The Ischl ultimatum followed within days. The demand for absolute authority over her children's upbringing. Franz Joseph gave in. Gondricourt was removed within the month. But here is what the Ischl ultimatum cannot undo. Rudolph was 6 years old when his mother won the argument. The damage had been accumulating for 6 years. The new tutor, Count Joseph Latour von Thurnberg, the liberal, the man who restored something of Rudolph's intellectual curiosity, was appointed too late to reach the boy Gondricourt had broken. He could educate the Crown Prince. He could not reconstruct the child. Rudolph grew into an adult who published his political views under pseudonyms because he could not say in his own name what he believed. His father's assessment of these views circulated at court in 4 words: Rudolph is prattling again. Rudolph's own assessment of his position has been preserved. It requires no interpretation. The lowest petty official has a larger sphere of influence than I. I am condemned to idleness. He married Princess Stephanie of Belgium on the 10th of May 1881. She was 16, he was 22. Their daughter, Archduchess Elisabeth, called Erzsi, was born the 2nd of September 1883. There would be no more children. Rudolph had infected Stephanie with gonorrhea. The infection rendered her unable to conceive again. The marriage deteriorated. Rudolph took large doses of morphine. He took mistresses. He published his politics under false names in liberal newspapers. Those who knew him well could see, by 1888, that they were watching a man approaching a limit. In the weeks before Mayerling, Rudolph wrote to a woman named Mitzi Kasper, a Viennese woman he had known for years, asking her to enter a suicide pact with him. She refused. She reportedly told the police. Nothing was done. 3 months later, he asked someone else. Rudolph wrote at least 5 farewell letters in his final days. Most have survived in some form. One was destroyed on explicit instruction, the longest of all, the only one written to his mother. We know 3 things it contained. We do not know the rest. On the evening of the 29th of January 1889, Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elisabeth gave a family dinner at the Hofburg. Rudolph attended. He excused himself early. He claimed to be indisposed. He had arranged a morning shoot at the Imperial Hunting Lodge at Mayerling, 26 kilometers southwest of Vienna, in the forested hills above Baden. He was travelling there with Count Joseph Hoyos, his hunting companion. Travelling separately, in another carriage, was Baroness Mary Wetzera. Mary Wetzera was born on the 19th of March, 1871. She died on the 30th of January, 1889. She was 17 years, 10 months, and 11 days old. She had left a note for her mother before leaving Vienna. She wrote that she was going to her death gladly. The note was not found until it was too late. At some point during the night of January 29th, into the morning of January 30th, Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria shot Mary Wetzera in the head and then shot himself. The valet Loschek went to Rudolph's room at the agreed time for the morning shoot. No answer. Count Hoyos came. Still no response. They worked on the door with a hammer, smashing through a panel large enough to reach the handle from inside. The room was shuttered and half dark. Rudolph was found at the side of the bed, slumped and bleeding from the mouth. On the bedside table, a glass and a mirror. On the bed lay Mary Wetzera. Rigor mortis had already set in. Count Hoyos left immediately. He took a special train to Vienna. And here is where the Habsburg court's machinery, the protocol, the hierarchy, the centuries of accumulated procedure for every occasion encountered something it had never been designed for. Nobody knew how to tell the emperor that his son was dead. Hoyos went to the emperor's adjutant general, Parr, and asked him to break the news. Parr refused. Only the empress could deliver catastrophic news to the emperor. Baron Nopsa, controller of the empress's household, was summoned. Nopsa, in turn, sent for Ida Ferenczy, Elizabeth's favourite Hungarian lady-in-waiting, the woman who had served her longer than almost anyone. Ferenczy went to find the empress. The empress was at her Greek lesson. She was impatient at the interruption. Nopsa must wait, she said. He must come back later. There was a lesson in progress. Ferenczy insisted. The news was urgent. The news concerned the crown prince. She entered the room a second time to find Elizabeth weeping uncontrollably. Out in the corridor, Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria, 58 years old, 41 years on the throne, the center of an empire of 52 million people, was standing in the hallway outside his wife's apartments, waiting to be admitted. Nopsa stood beside him, maintaining composure only by visible effort. The Empress came out. She took her husband inside. She closed the door. She told him in private. Then, because she understood that Franz Joseph would need someone whose specific function was comfort rather than mourning, she went to find Katharina Schratt. Schratt was Franz Joseph's mistress. Elisabeth had known this for years. She had, by most accounts, been quietly relieved by it. Schratt was warm and uncomplicated, and gave the Emperor something his wife could not reliably provide. On the morning of the 30th of January, 1889, Elisabeth walked to Katharina Schratt and brought her to her husband so that he would not face what was coming alone. Then she went to tell her daughter. She told Marie Valerie that Rudolph was very sick, with no hope of recovery. Marie Valerie asked immediately, "Has he killed himself?" Elisabeth answered, "No, no, I will not believe that. It is so likely, so certain that the girl poisoned him." This exchange is recorded by both Ferenczi and Marie Valerie. In those hours, Elisabeth still believed Mayerling was a murder, that Mary Vetsera had killed Rudolph. The other version, that her son had planned this, had invited a 17-year-old girl to die beside him, had arranged everything in advance, was not yet something she could hold. The truth arrived the following morning, from the court physician. Both had been shot in the head. Mary Vetsera lay on the bed with a rose between her hands. Rudolph lay beside her, a fallen revolver on the ground. Elisabeth's response to this information was recorded. She said, "Great Jehovah is terrible as he marches onward, sowing destruction like the storm." By noon on January 30, the official gazette had published its statement on behalf of the Emperor. Crown Prince Rudolph had died of rupture of an aneurysm of the heart. Mary Vetsera was buried in haste, her uncles propping her body upright with a broomstick as they left the lodge, carrying her out as though she were still alive, maintaining the fiction of departure until they were clear of the imperial grounds. Her mother was not permitted to see the grave for over 2 months after the burial. It was, in every technical sense, the Habsburg court functioning exactly as designed. There is a version of this story in which Rudolph's death draws his mother's surviving children closer to her. It is not the version that happened. In the days immediately following Mayerling, Elisabeth was, by all accounts, remarkable. Franz Joseph was undone. The man who had ruled an empire for 41 years sat in his apartments and could not move. He named his wife and his 2 daughters angels for the steadiness they provided in those days. The same woman who had been absent from her children's daily lives for 3 decades was, in the crisis, the one who held the structure together. She told Stephanie. She faced Helene von Vetsera, Mary's desperate mother, who had come to the Hofburg demanding her daughter, not yet knowing her daughter was dead, and told her herself. Marie Valerie recorded the scene. Elisabeth standing before the weeping woman who demanded her child back, and then the revelation that Rudolph too was dead. Vetsera on her knees, clasping the Empress's hands, and Elisabeth leaving with 5 words. "And now remember, Rudolph died of a heart attack." But composure was not recovery. In the months following Mayerling, Elisabeth gave away her coloured clothes. A court observer noted her at a dinner, described her, dressed like a nun in a high-necked black wool dress, with a long crepe veil hanging down from her head, and a necklace of black wooden beads, with a large medallion containing a lock of Rudolph's hair, which she wore at the side like an order. By July 1889, 6 months after Mayerling, Gisela warned Marie Valerie to keep a close eye on their mother when they visited a waterfall. Not because they thought she might fall. The relationship between Sisi and Gisela, already a relationship of gifts and letters from a distance, of an inn chosen over a palace on the night of the first grandchild's birth, did not become closer in grief. Grief exposed the gulf rather than bridged it. There was nothing to build on. The foundations had been removed too long ago. Elizabeth had written poetry since adolescence. After Sophie died in Buda in 1857, she wrote. After Mayerling, she wrote. She had no other place to put what she could not say in court, and could not say in protocol, and could not say to a husband who had already given her everything, except the thing she needed. What historians describe, reading her poetry across 5 decades, is the record of a mind working through an argument with God that God kept losing. After Rudolph's death, the argument became something else. She told Marie Valerie, "If I could have Rudolph back, it would be as a daughter, not as crown prince." She was saying, "I wanted a person. I was given an heir. The empire required the heir. The person was consumed by the requirement." And at some point the exact date is uncertain, she said the worst thing she ever said, or the most honest, which sometimes amounts to the same. The noblest deed would be if all parents killed every newborn child immediately. It was written down, it was not retracted. After Elizabeth died in 1898, her lady-in-waiting Ida Ferenczi carried out one final instruction. She took Rudolph's letter to his mother, the longest farewell of all, and she burned it. We know 3 things it contained. We do not know the rest. On the command of Emperor Franz Joseph, the hunting lodge at Mayerling was torn down. A convent for Carmelite nuns was built in its place. The church's altar was positioned directly on the site where the bodies had been found. In a side chapel to the left of the altar stands a statue. It is the Virgin Mary, Our Lady of Sorrows, at the moment of her greatest grief, being stabbed through the heart. The statue was donated to the convent by Empress Elisabeth. It was made by the sculptor Victor Tilgner. Statue at Mayerling, Sisi commissioned It Looks Like Her. Visitors who have come to Mayerling for 130 years, historians, pilgrims, journalists, tourists, who came because of the films, have looked at that statue and noticed the same thing. It bears an eerie resemblance to Elizabeth. She placed her own likeness at the site of her son's death. She commissioned a figure of a woman being stabbed through the heart, and she put it where he died, and she had it built to last. She never visited Mayerling again. She visited the Capuchin crypt in Vienna once, alone. After Rudolph's funeral, she sent the monks out. She stood in the silence and waited for something, for a sign, for a presence, for Rudolph's spirit to appear and tell her what he needed. He never came. She had one more child. The 4th, the one born in 1868, in Buda, not in Vienna, not in the Hofburg, not in any of the birthing chambers where Habsburg children had arrived for 3 centuries. In Buda, deliberately. As a political statement, a claim, an act of maternal authority by a woman who had already lost 2 children to her mother-in-law and watched a 3rd being broken by a military tutor. This child was born in Hungary, in the city of the country Elizabeth loved, and she was raised in Hungarian, and she was called Die Einzige. The only one. The court used the phrase as a weapon. It was accurate as an observation. Elizabeth behaved as though she had only one child in any emotional sense, and the court intended it to wound. It did wound. Marie Valerie recorded in her diary, beginning in childhood, the confusion of being simultaneously the beloved child and the proof of her mother's failures with every other child she had. Rudolph, growing up in the Hofburg under the shadow of Gondrecourt and Franz Joseph's expectations, watched his baby sister receive what he had wanted and never received. His mother's full attention, her language, The Hungarian, she spoke exclusively with Marie Valerie, the same woman who had exchanged formal German with Rudolph in the official visits she managed from a distance. He was cold to Marie Valerie for years. He ignored her. He made her feel unwanted in the sibling unit he shared with Gisela, the sister who had also been raised without their mother. Marie Valerie understood the jealousy only later, when she was old enough to understand what Rudolph had not had and what she had been given. By then, Rudolph was already at Mayerling. The question that Mayerling left, the question that historians have been unable to fully answer, is not why Rudolph died. The evidence for why Rudolph died accumulated over decades. The pistol shots in the night, the idleness of a crown he could never wear, the marriage he had destroyed, the morphine, the gonorrhea, the body and mind of a man running at a deficit he could not repay. The question is, could it have been stopped? In the weeks before Mayerling, Crown Prince Rudolph approached a woman named Mitzi Kaspar, a Viennese woman, someone he had known for years, someone he trusted in ways he could not trust the court. He asked her to enter a suicide pact with him. She refused. She reportedly went to the police. The police did nothing. 3 months after Mitzi Kaspar refused him, Rudolph asked someone else. He asked a 17-year-old girl named Mary Vetsera. She did not refuse. In 1872, 4 years after Marie Valerie's birth, the same year that Archduchess Sophie of Austria finally died after a long illness, a letter surfaced from her archive. She had written to Elizabeth's mother, Duchess Ludovica of Bavaria, about her granddaughter. The woman who had taken Sophie, the woman who had supervised Gisela, the woman who had appointed Gondrecourt, the woman who had sat knitting outside the birthing chamber in 1855 and named the baby before the mother was asked. In the letter, she described Marie Valerie. Sisi is completely absorbed by her love and care for this irresistible little angel. There is no record of what Duchess Ludovica wrote back. There is no record of what Elizabeth felt, reading an acknowledgement of her love for Marie Valerie from the woman who had made love for her other children so difficult. By 1872, Archduchess Sophie was dying. By 1872, the question of who controlled whom was becoming irrelevant. What matters is the letter exists. The woman who had dismantled Elizabeth's first 3 attempts at motherhood recognized, in the 4th attempt, that something different was happening. She put it in writing. She was not wrong. On the 31st of July, 1890, Archduchess Marie Valerie of Austria married Archduke Franz Salvator of Austria-Tuscany. She moved to Wolsey Castle in Upper Austria. She would go on to have 10 children. She would become known in the region as the Angel of Wolsey. By every account, she built the kind of settled, warm, domestic life that her mother had never found and her brother had never survived to attempt. Elizabeth attended the wedding. Then she left. I told you about the farewell letters. Rudolph wrote at least 5 in his final days at Mayerling. Most have survived in some form. To Stephanie, his wife, Dear Stephanie, you are freed henceforward from the torment of my presence. I face death calmly. Death alone can save my good name. Clear, precise, the language of a man who had made the decision and was closing accounts. The letter to his mother was the longest of all. 3 things are known about its contents. He wrote that he was not worthy to write to his father, meaning Franz Joseph. He wrote that Mary Vetsera was a pure angel. He wrote that he wished to be buried at Heiligenkreuz, the monastery near Mayerling, where the monks would have been willing. He was not buried at Heiligenkreuz. He is in the imperial crypt in Vienna, beside the other Habsburgs, in the place the dynasty required. The rest of the letter, everything beyond those 3 known fragments, we do not know. After Elizabeth died on the 10th of September 1898, her lady-in-waiting Ida Ferenczi, the Hungarian woman who had served her for decades, who had been the one to interrupt the Greek lesson on the morning of Mayerling, carried out one final instruction. The instruction had been given in advance, in writing, on the explicit order of the Empress. Ferenczi took Rudolph's letter to his mother, the longest farewell, the one written in the hours before he died, the one Elizabeth had carried for 9 years, and she burned it. What Rudolph wrote to his mother in his last hours, she decided no one else would read, not the historians, not the court, not Franz Joseph, not us. In the 8 years between Marie Valerie's marriage and her own death, Elizabeth travelled. She went to Corfu, to the Achilleon, the palace she had built for herself on the Greek coast, designed around the mythology of Achilles, the hero who chose a short, glorious life over a long, ordinary one. She went to the Swiss lakes, she went to the Bavarian mountains, she went to England, she went to the places she had always gone when she could not be in Vienna. But there was a difference now. Before Mayerling, Elizabeth's travels had been an escape, a refusal, a woman choosing her own itinerary rather than the court's. After Mayerling, they were something else. Marie Valerie wrote in her diary that her mother envies Rudolph's death and longs for it day and night. That sentence is not a metaphor. Marie Valerie was precise with language. She was recording what she observed. Elizabeth herself, in those years, made it explicit in different ways. In 1889, 6 months after Mayerling, Gisela had warned Marie Valerie to watch their mother closely near waterfalls, not because they were worried about accidents. Elizabeth wore black every day from the 30th of January 1889 until the day she died. She kept her hair covered with a long veil. The medallion of Rudolph's hair never left her neck. She was 60 years old by 1897. 60, and she still maintained the exercises, still weighed herself, still moved through the world at the pace nobody else could match, not because she wanted to live, but because the body she had spent 40 years disciplining continued operating regardless of what she wanted. In the final years, Marie Valerie visited her mother when she could from Walsey, from wherever Elizabeth's travels briefly intersected with a place they could meet. In those visits, Elizabeth talked about her children. Not about their achievements, not about the dynasty, about what had happened and what she understood about it now, at 60, with the distance of decades and the proximity of grief. Marie Valerie wrote it all down. The substance of what Elizabeth said can be found distributed across her daughter's diary in the years before September 1898, that she had been a mother, fully, to only one of the 4. That she knew this, that she could account for what had happened to each of them and trace the line from each outcome back to the same source, the Hofburg, the protocol, the machine that had processed her children as dynastic requirements and returned them to her damaged or not at all. She said, of all 4 children, only Marie Valerie had received what a child was supposed to receive. She meant it as a compliment. Marie Valerie received it as a weight. In September 1898, despite being warned about possible assassination attempts, Elizabeth travelled to Geneva. She was travelling as the Countess of Hohenheim's incognito, as she often did, the fiction of anonymity she maintained, even when everyone present knew who she was. She was staying at the Hotel Beau Rivage on the shore of Lake Geneva. On the morning of September 10, she was due to take the steamship Genève across the lake to Montreux. Luigi Lucchesi had not come to Geneva to kill Empress Elisabeth. He had come to kill Prince Philippe, Duke of Orléans, the Orléanist claimant to the French throne, who had been in the city. but the Duke had already left for a tour of the Swiss Valais before Lucchesi could act. Then a Geneva newspaper published a report that the guest registered as the Countess of Hohenems at the Hotel Beau Rivage was, in fact, the Empress of Austria. Lucchesi read the newspaper and changed his plan. He had been born in Paris in April 1873 as the abandoned son of an Italian worker, left at a foundling hospital, raised in orphanages and with foster families. He had worked as a day labourer across Switzerland and Austria-Hungary, earning wages that left him permanently at the edge of survival. By 1898, he considered himself an anarchist, though he was not in contact with any organised anarchist network. He had concluded that royal persons were parasites, and that killing one would constitute what the anarchist movement called the propaganda of the deed violence as political statement. He could not afford a revolver. He could not afford a dagger. He found a needle file, the kind used in industrial factories to sharpen equipment eyes, and sharpened it on 3 sides. He attached a wooden handle. On the 10th of September, 1898, at 1:35 inches the afternoon, Empress Elisabeth of Austria and her lady-in-waiting, Countess Irma Stare, walked from the Beau Rivage toward the landing stage. They were strolling. The ship's bell had rung. They were unhurried. Lucchesi rushed at her. He thrust the file into her chest above her left breast and pulled it out and ran. Neither woman understood what had happened. The wound was so small, a 4-inch file, sharpened thin, that it left almost no visible mark. Elizabeth stumbled, fell to the ground. She stood up. A coachman and several bystanders rushed to help. She thanked them. She and Countess Stare continued the 100 yards to the landing stage and boarded the Genève. For approximately 10 minutes on the deck of the steamship, Elizabeth of Austria talked to her lady-in-waiting. Normal conversation, the incident, how strange it had been. The ship moved out of harbour onto the blue surface of Lake Geneva. Then she collapsed. Stare caught her, lowered her to the deck. She called urgently for a doctor. There was none on board. A fellow passenger who had once trained as a nurse came forward. 3 men carried Elizabeth to the upper deck and laid her on a bench. Stare cut the laces of her corset. The Empress's eyes opened. Countess Irma Stare later described what she saw in that moment. She used 6 words. Behind them I saw death. Elizabeth asked, "What has happened to me?" Those were her last words. The corset had contained the hemorrhage, the pressure of the garment she had worn every day for 40 years, the instrument of the 50-centimetre waist, the discipline. The diamond stars and the winter halter portrait had been the only thing keeping her blood inside her body. When it was removed, the hemorrhage filled the pericardial sac around her heart. Captain Roux turned the ship around and returned to Geneva. 4 sailors carried Elizabeth from the ship on an improvised stretcher of 2 oars, a sail, and seat cushions. She was brought back to the Hotel Beau Rivage. She had already stopped breathing on the water. 2 doctors arrived. A priest arrived. Dr. Mayer made a small incision in her arm. There was no blood flow. Empress Elisabeth of Austria was pronounced dead at 2:20 p.m., the 10th of September, 1898. She had wanted to be buried in Corfu, near the sea, in the country of Achilles, and the palace she had built to outlast everything she could not control. She is buried in the imperial crypt in Vienna, with the Habsburgs, in the place the dynasty required. The question everybody asks about Empress Elisabeth is, why did she flee? Why did she travel when she should have stayed? Why did she put distance between herself and her children when they needed her? Why did she let the Hofburg machine take Sophie and Gisela and Rudolph and only really fight back for Marie Valerie? The answer is in the question nobody asks instead. Why did she fight for Marie Valerie? Because by 1868, Archduchess Sophie was dying. Because by 1868, the machine was weakening. Because for the first time in her marriage, the obstacle between her and her own child was becoming removable. And the moment she could be a mother genuinely, daily, in the language she chose, in the country she loved, she was. Completely, utterly. In a way that the court found excessive, that Rudolph found unbearable to witness, that Gisela never received and never stopped noticing. The question is not why she fled. The question is, what would she have been, what would Sophie, Gisela, and Rudolph have had if she had ever been given the same choice earlier? We will never know. But Marie Valerie knew. She wrote it down. She outlived her mother by 50 years, raised 10 children at Walsey, and burned nothing. Luigi Lucchesi was sentenced to life imprisonment in the canton of Geneva. He lived for 12 more years in his cell. On the 19th of October, 1910, he hanged himself with a belt. His body was buried on the prison grounds. His head was removed, studied by a professor of phrenology looking for evidence of criminal predisposition in the brain, found unremarkable, stitched back together, and preserved in a jar of formaldehyde. The jar was transferred to Vienna in 1985. In February 2000, the head was quietly interred at Vienna's Zentralfriedhof. It is approximately 8 kilometers from the imperial crypt where Empress Elisabeth is buried. They have been in the same city, 8 kilometers apart, for 25 years. She has been in that crypt since 1898. He was in that crypt city, in a formaldehyde jar, from 1985 until 2000. He was there, in Vienna, while she was there, in Vienna, for 15 years. The anarchist who wanted to go down in history, and the empress who wanted to be buried near the sea. Neither of them got what they wanted.